All right, so here we are. Chapter 16 Notes, Part 2. Continuing on, talking about different forms of evidence that were leading naturalists of the day to consider the idea that organisms had changed over time. So geology was one place to look for evidence. So different parts of the world, they were able to find identical sequences of rock layers around the globe on the different continents. Within those different layers of rock, they held different fossils. So fossils are evidence of earlier forms of life. There was a pattern that emerged comparing fossils from deeper, older layers of rock compared to layers in more recent layers of rock. The organisms in those deeper layers of rock were simpler organisms, simpler fossils, and got a little more complex as we got further along in the fossil record toward more current day. So older layers, more simple organisms, getting more complex over time, and different, greater biodiversity, I guess, shown in the fossil record as time went on. In some cases, there were fossils of animals that had no living representatives, creatures that we don't see present day. So the idea of extinction came into being as a thing that happens to living things. Some of the organisms that were found in the fossil record were considered transitional fossils. So we have birds today living, and we have reptiles today living, but the Archaeopteryx was an organism that had characteristics of lizards or reptiles and birds. And so that was evidence, again, that got people thinking about organisms changing over time. It's also worth noting that the fossil record will never be complete. Geological events like volcanoes and earthquakes, mudslides, all kinds of things can interfere with the fossil record, wipe it out completely. It also needs to be known that the fossil record is really favoring organisms that have skeletons, shells, some part of their body that has hardness to it. Soft-bodied organisms like earthworms are more limited. It would be very, very difficult to have them fossilize. It is possible to have conditions where they fossilize, but not very often. And so the fossil record is going to be heavily in favor of recording the lives of species that had shells and skeletons, bony skeletons, versus those that had no skeleton or shells. It also is going to favor species that were well distributed across the earth and those that persisted for a long time in Earth's history. So if an organism lived on Earth for a very brief period of time in only a very small area of the world, it's very likely that the fossil record would never even have evidence that it existed. So there's probably a lot of species that we will never ever know about, and that's just how it is. The fossil record is incomplete and always will be. There's a whole section on different types of fossils. We're not going to spend time trying to figure out those. If you are curious about learning about the different types of fossils, I might throw an extra credit question your way. If it's something that interests you, you could get a bonus for having some knowledge of that, but in general, we're not going to spend time on that. Comparative morphology was mentioned as a place for evidence. And so what does that mean? Well, morphology is studying something's form. We learned about that in 10th grade biology. Characteristics that an organism has that we can see and observe in their physical structure. So in these examples, the pterosaur, the chicken, the penguin, the porpoise, the bat, the human, and the elephant, they all have a forearm, an upper limb that's close to their neck or shoulder, or attaches to their neck shoulder area. And what you'll notice is that they all have a similar structure. They are put together in a very similar way. Similar bones, a humerus, a radius and ulna, and sometimes they end up fusing together with other bones, but they have the same basic arrangement. But what's unique about these different organisms is, what do these forearms do? What is their function? So a pterosaur would be an ancient reptile that flew or glided. Chickens, of course, have wings for flight. Penguins use their wing for swimming. Porpoises use their forearm for swimming. A bat uses their forearm to fly. Obviously, human forearm does all the things that people do with their arms and hands. And then the elephant. Very, very different adaptation functionally for these organisms, but a very similar structure, indicating that they had a common origin long time ago that had a similar structure. So comparative morphology, this would be an example of homologous structures or homologous structure. This picture shows one type of adaptation, appendages used for flight. The appendages used for flight in this insect and this bat and this bird, they have a very different function or a very different origin. So the way that wings form on an insect is very different from the way that they form in the growth and development of a bat versus the wing of a bird and the development of its flight feathers. So how these wings developed in these different organisms is not the same. They originated separately to solve a similar problem, and that is locomotion through the air. So in this case, they have the similar function, but a different root structure. So these are called analogous structures. So this picture, these set of three pictures here are representing analogous structures. And then in some cases, organisms have remnant structures. They have something left in their body that no longer has a functional purpose, but is still there. For example, in the great whales in the ocean, they don't have legs. But if you were to dissect one and look inside, you would see a tiny pelvis and a little bone that would be a femur, like a thigh bone on us, and then a little nubbin bone off of that. So these are vestigial legs or vestigial hips. So there would be no reason for this to develop on a whale as it is, because it serves no purpose. So the only other thing that makes sense is that it once was was functional in its historic past. And so we can look back at fossil records and see whale-like creatures that did have rudimentary legs that just got smaller and smaller over time until they no longer appeared on the outside. And so these are known as vestigial structures. So structures on the organisms today that no longer function as they once did. Another example of vestigial structures would be if you were to study some fish that are cave dwelling and never see the light of day. They have eyes. They have a place where eyes go, and you'd see a little thing where the eyes are, but they have non-functioning eyes. The eyes don't develop into organs that sense light anymore because they have no need in a cave. So they've lost the use of their eye. It is a vestigial structure. So again, comparative morphology. Here are the definitions of these things that I just went over for you to record for yourself. So if you need to pause and get these down, feel free. I'm going to skip ahead to the next slide on biogeography. So what is biogeography? Well, bio is life. Geography is distribution of things across the globe spatially. So when you think of geography, you think of maps because they show you where things are in the area on the globe. So where is life found along the globe? That's what biogeography is looking at or exploring. Patterns and distribution of species across the globe. In the late 1800s, Alfred Wallace and others were kind of known for discussing and sharing ideas about biogeography. So these are all large flightless birds on different continents of the earth. So this is the emu from Australia, the rhea from South America, and the ostrich from Africa. So they ended up adapting similarly in similar types of habitats. And so then, of course, naturalists are trying to explain why did that happen? How did that happen? And of course, plate tectonics and shifting of continents, that knowledge was something that was pieced together and helped explain a lot of these questions that people had. But again, the Earth is not static, it changed over time. So for our final stretch and part 3, we're going to shift into some folks that were instrumental in this process of tying these ideas together, kind of a little bit about each of their claims to fame. So in chapter 16, you would have read about the few people that we're going to talk about. So we're going to start with a who is it and their picture and give you some information and then reveal their name. And so if you've done some reading ahead of time, you might be able to answer the question before their name is revealed. But we're going to end part 2 here and pick up part 3 with this same slide.